anyway, I don't want to shock anybody right at the beginning of my sermon, but I think I'm just going to let the cat out of the bag so that I can breathe. It happened to me late last night, or should I say early this morning, when I reached this irrevocable decision that my sermon today would only have 1 point. Now, I'm not sure if you're going to be okay with that. I would hate to knock you sideways. You normally manage, although only just 3 points. Of course, by Tuesday midday, you remember only 1 of my points. So today, if I give you 1 point only, are you going to try harder to cope with it for the entire week until next Sunday? Unless, of course, there is somebody sitting in the pews in front of me who would absolutely insist that there has to be 3 points this morning, because I've got them on standby. You see, this is what happened. I prepared my sermon, and I thought to myself as I was writing and writing and writing, and then typing and typing and typing, that this is going to be a very long sermon. Maybe I must put away the 2 points for next week and only give you the 1 for today. But then, of course, a new problem arose, and that problem was that we might get out of here too early, maybe at 11:45, let's say. And I thought that wouldn't be lekker, since you love church and all, particularly in this wonderful sunny weather. So, can I continue? Do you want only 1 point? Yes. Are you going to be here next week for the 2 remaining points? Yes. Okay, let me just quickly do a quick scan and see who's here. You better rock up next week as well, okay? So this morning's sermon will, in other words, be to be continued. Last week, we discussed the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah. He's right up there with Isaiah and Ezekiel. He was one of the major prophets in the times of the Old Testament. Of course, there are also lots of minor prophets, those guys with the funny names that all sound the same, like Obadiah and Nahum and Habakkuk and so on. But the 3 main oaks at the time were Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. They didn't only have a very significant for God's people in that specific context, their material is also much more comprehensive. I don't know how I missed it over 24 years of preaching, but I only found out 2 weeks ago when I was preparing for last Sunday that the book of Jeremiah had 52 chapters. I don't know how that eluded me over 2.5 decades of preaching. But anyway, now I know. He must have been a man with a huge message for God's people. He must have been a man with an enormous sense of mission, and that is why he just preached at every opportunity. To the extent that we have in our Bibles ended up with 52 long, drawn-out chapters. I suppose why I hadn't shown any fascination or interest in his work up to now could be because he was so darn negative that his sermons dripped with sadness and depression, and I just would be put off after 1 chapter, let alone 52 consecutive chapters. It looks like the prophet hadn't had enough by the time he got to chapter 52. It looks like he took a break after that preaching, and then guess what? He realized, oh, I've got something more to say. I've got something more to express about my disillusionment and my disheartenment and my discouragement. So I'm going to create an addendum to my main book, and it's probably going to be called Lamentations. And guess what? Those who compiled the Bible centuries later couldn't come up with a better name than Lamentations. So Jeremiah has gone down in history as somebody who has left a rich, if depressing, legacy in his book Jeremiah, and then also his appendix, Lamentations. Guess what Bible scholars use as a term when they talk about Jeremiah? I suppose in 2 words it summarizes all that he was about. When we talk about Jeremiah in theological circles, we call him the weeping prophet. I wonder why. Probably because he was weeping all the time. By the looks of it, 24/7. I'll give him this though. I'll give him that at least he had reason to cry. You see, he was called by God at a very vital part in Israel's history, just before the Babylonian captivity. Not only was he there on the day when the Babylonians viciously came to burn down the temple and pillage the city and rape the women and then audaciously drag God's people into exile in the country between two rivers, namely the Tigris and the Euphrates. Poor Jeremiah saw it coming on for miles and miles and months before the time. And then the poor man was also himself taken into exile. He's the only prophet who saw the before part and then the exile itself. He is known as the weeping prophet because he was weeping not only about what had taken place, with the exile actually becoming a reality. He was also weeping because God's people wouldn't listen. He had issued warning after warning, reprimand after reprimand, and the people just ignored his truthful messages. And so they made their own fate really, really bad and questionable. Jeremiah looks as if he also suffered severe depression with how this whole captivity thing was working out. But every now and then, there are sentences of positivity. Sentences that speak of light and even life in the midst of his time of crisis and emergency. For those who remember, this is the verse that we looked at last week, for I unpacked for us Lamentations 3, verse 55. It's a verse that I hadn't known all my life. Perhaps I stumbled across it 15 years ago. But let me tell you, I have been holding on to it for dear life ever since. For I find it a pleasant surprise that even Jeremiah, in his broken-heartedness, could still have a sense of faith and trust in spite of everything. What does Jeremiah 3, verse 55 say? It says the following. It's the prophet speaking in the first person. I called on the name of the Lord when I was in the pit. He drew near to me, for he had heard my cry. He came near to me and said, do not be afraid. There's just something about that line that constantly speaks to me, that constantly inspires my courage and my confidence. For Jeremiah makes it abundantly clear that in spite of his situation, in spite of his life finding itself in the darkness of a pit, when he cried to the Lord heard his plea. And so perhaps we don't need 3 points this morning. Perhaps the one will suffice. Perhaps this first point and only point I'm wanting to make today will be enough. The fact that he cried out to the Lord and then had his cry heard speaks volumes not only of his desperation, but also of the beauty of God's faithfulness and care. Let's look at where his life was at the time. Now we know that the prophet was a little bit of a drama queen, right? Because of the rich imagery he would often use to describe his fate and what had happened to the people of God. And so it's no coincidence that he describes his situation as his life being in a pit. Now perhaps I don't have to go into the gory details. Perhaps you know exactly what I mean when I say he was in a pit. Maybe you yourself have been there personally. A deep, dark, miry, slimy pit. And we know what that kind of situation does to our minds. No wonder Jeremiah was so very, very depressed. Perhaps as I speak for you, it's not only a past thing. Perhaps that's where your life is at right now. Perhaps some of you are straining your hands because you want to put up your hand and say, Bevan, I know exactly what you're talking about because my life is in a dark place at the moment. It feels like I am stuck in a pit and I don't know how I'm going to get out of here. Those were the circumstances of Jeremiah, weren't they? And so I think there's almost an element of surprise when the prophet found out that his prayer had been heard, for he expected the opposite. It looks like Jeremiah, the way he had lamented his life, had convinced himself that God was no longer interested in his fate. That God no longer cared for his well-being. That God was sitting somewhere in his cozy heaven, perhaps with earplugs in, not wanting to hear his constant weeping. Perhaps with earphones, let alone earplugs. Perhaps Jeremiah had come to create this concept in his mind that God had put earphones over his ears, listening to some hip-hop, trying his best to ignore the cry of the prophet. But Jeremiah soon found that that was all lies. That nothing could be further from the truth. For even after all those years, even after everything that the prophet had to endure, even as he was sitting in a deep, deep, desperate pit, even from that place, God heard his cry. And so if you are in a pit in your life at this point in time, I want to say to you, do not despair. Do not give up. Do not turn your back on whatever faith you have left. But I want to encourage you to find all the little bits of faith lying all over the areas of your life. I want you to scrape together those pieces of faith, and I want you to bring them all to this moment, and I want you to make your plea known to Almighty God. And I want to give you, as far as it's humanly possible, the guarantee that He hears your cry. Jeremiah must have, at some point along the line, at some point he must have said, you know what? It looks like God is gone able, meaning absent, without leave. It must have felt to Jeremiah that God had abandoned him, that God had abandoned His people, that God was no longer listening to their prayers, and that God had finally decided to make a new beginning, maybe on Mars. That's all the stuff that must have been milling around in Jeremiah's mind, non-stop. He probably had reached the stage where he said to himself, I'm going to give this one more try. I'm going to cry out to God, and then that will be that. If He doesn't hear, we will part ways once and for all. But then God lived up to his name once again. Not only did God hear the cry of the prophet, God also drew near to him, and God said to him in an unmistakable whisper, "Do not be afraid." Jeremiah's cry wasn't the first cry God ever heard. God had this whole trend going long before Jeremiah even existed. In Genesis 4, so right at the beginning of the Bible, so rewind a tad for me. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, after all that terrible stuff with Cain and Abel wanting to murder each other and all that jealousy and so on, that chapter ends with this line. At about this time, the person who wrote the book of Genesis says, Genesis 4 verse 26, at about this time, people started calling on the name of the Lord. So Jeremiah wasn't the first one to take this initiative, to start this pattern, saying, let's begin this thing of calling on God's name. No, it had happened for many, many years before. And it's still happening today, so by the way, by people like us, calling out to God when we are in a crisis, when we are feeling desperate, when we are sitting in a pit. In Exodus chapter 17, Moses tries the same thing. Moses had lots and lots of trouble with these difficult people that had just come out of Egyptian slavery. One would think that they would have been in a good mood, after all that God had done for them, getting them through the Red Sea in time, etc., etc. But it looks like from the minute they got out of there, they were just complaining left, right, and center, and Moses had to put up with the brunt of it. So they got to a place in Exodus chapter 17 where there's no water. They run to Moses and they complain like it's going out of fashion. Moses did what Jeremiah would do centuries later. He cried out to God. And he said to God, "Hey man, you've got to come through for me here. Your people are unhappy. This is a desperate situation. The women are bitching. The men are disgruntled. The children are misbehaving. What am I going to do?" And then God, of course, gave him the advice of tapping the rock on the right side of the fountain, the dried up fountain at that stage. And he did that, and voila, water came gushing out. God came through for his servant Moses and provided for his people just like he said he would. We have King Solomon in 2 Chronicles 7 also crying out to God. It was at the context of the temple being dedicated. So there we also have some proof of how God hears our cries and how God listens to our pleas. The best example that we probably have in Scripture would be countless Psalms that speak of how God hears our cries. In Psalm 34 verse 6, we have somebody writing in the third person saying, "This poor little man," referring to himself as the psalmist, "this poor little man cried out to God, and he delivered me from all of my fears." In that same psalm we read, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He is good to those who take refuge in him." Psalm 116 opens with the words, "I love the Lord because he has heard my cry." I personally could think of lots of other reasons for why I would love the Lord, but I suppose I can add to my list of reasons the fact that he hears my cry. For that was what stirred a love in the heart of whoever wrote Psalm 116, as he starts with that line, I love the Lord because, why? Because he hears my cry. I remember from my youth pastor days how I would always teach the youngsters an emergency number. 5015. 5015, because that's a reference to Psalm 50, verse 15, where God makes another irretrievable promise. For there in Psalm 50, verse 15, God says, call on me on your day of trouble, and I will save you. To this day, I haven't been able to forget the emergency number, 5015. When we find ourselves in a desperate place, when we find ourselves in a place where we feel we cannot go on, where the night is just too dark and the day is too lonely and too long, we know where to go. We go to places like Psalm 50, verse 15. We call on him in our most desperate moment, and he will save us. Jeremiah was there, and all he had was a prayer. But that simple childlike prayer paid off so very beautifully. There's a place where Jeremiah says, and I can only say it in Afrikaans because the English spoils it a little bit. There's a place where Jeremiah says, Here, ek het in u bly glo, selfs toe ek gedink het, dit is klaar met my. Because I cut my other 2 points, I'm just quickly calculating where I must go now. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 2. For there we find evidence that some of our crying, and that some of our praying, and that some of our calling out to God doesn't necessarily need to have words added. In Exodus chapter 2, towards the end of that passage, I think it's verses 23 to 25, somewhere there, it is written that God saw the suffering of his people, that God had compassion for their need. Remember, that's the time when they were still in Egyptian slavery. That God had compassion on his people, that God saw their suffering, and that God heard their groaning. Now that very term haunted me for quite a while. For as far as I know, groaning doesn't have any intelligible words, does it? Isn't groaning a sound you make? A sound from deep down here, from your gut? So it means that somebody else wouldn't be able to make sense if you gave a groan. But it looks like God is quite into it. For God apparently notices even when his people groan. That's what it says there in Exodus 2, somewhere between verses 23 and 25. For let's be honest with ourselves. Sometimes when we are really broken, when we feel really despairing, when it feels as if we are choking on our loneliness, when it feels as if we are crippled by our fears, then in those moments we can't think of any words to pray, can we? But it looks like God zooms in on our lives even when we are wordlessly groaning. That is the extent to which He cares for us. Sometimes we don't have to cry out at the top of our voice. Sometimes we can just give a painful groan and God will be there like a bear. Not only do our groans get to God's ears, it looks like there's another kind of crying out that God seems to have down to a T. It's another speechless form of prayer, of praying and pleading. It looks like God reads our tears also as prayers. There's a psalm which goes as far as saying, Psalm 54, that God sits by whenever we cry, and that God collects our tears in a bucket. Who would have known that God would go as far as this, saying that every tear that rolls down our cheek is a treasure to Him, that He takes our grief and our sorrow seriously, that when we weep, it matters to God. Jeremiah was in such a bad space. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would get out of the pit alive. He didn't know if the people who hadn't heeded his preaching would survive. Everything felt lost and God felt far, far away. But nothing could have been further from the truth. For Jeremiah himself had said in chapter 31, speaking on God's behalf, I love you with an everlasting love. And only a few verses before verse 55 in chapter 3 of the Lamentations does Jeremiah say to God in some kind of faithful prayer, Lord, your faithfulness is great. Your mercies are new every morning. Everything that I have needed, your hand has provided. And it looks like even when he was at his lowest, Jeremiah held on to that truth for dear life. In preparation for today, I accidentally discovered a website on the internet called Reasons for Why God Won't Answer Your Prayers. And I fell off my seat when I saw that. It upset me no end. I didn't open it because I thought this is a bit technical. Don't give me a whole lesson on why God wouldn't answer my prayers. I'm not interested in that. For me, there's only one thing on that list. If God doesn't answer my prayers in a way that I prefer, it simply means that He knows better. And I'll just settle for that. I'm not going to go into all this info of why God would or wouldn't answer my prayer. I know not in my heart, but with my heart. There's a difference. I know with my heart that when I call out to Him, He turns His ear to listen to my plea for help, to listen to my cry of loneliness and fear. I know that He holds me dear. I know that He wants me to be well and happy. And I know that He holds me in His heart. I'm looking forward to giving you my other 2 points next week, but this is where we'll end for now. I want to say to you today, next time you are struggling, next time when your faith is holding on by a thin little thread, next time when you feel as if God can't possibly be listening to your prayers, remember this sermon on Jeremiah. And remember how Jeremiah discovered after all that he mattered to God and that his prayers were precious to him. Our minds, I'm almost done. Our minds constantly play havoc with us, isn't it? Our minds constantly say to us, you know what, God's done with you. This is it. God's finished. Don't think that you still stand a chance. Our minds come and tell us all these untruths. Now, next time when your mind comes to play with you like that, and when your mind says to you that God doesn't care about you, that God doesn't remember you, and that God can't possibly love you after all that you've put him through, I want you to tell your mind to shut up. You know that song by Black Eyed Peas? It's probably a bit mod for you, eh? Shut up, just shut up, shut up. Do you not know it? I didn't expect you to, so it's no biggie for me. But next time your mind tells you that, I want you to tell your mind, shut the hell up. For this I know to be true, that my tears are cherished by God, that my prayers are heard by him, that he listens to my cry, that he holds me dear, and that he holds my life safely in his heart. Amen.